And here we are. They say I am live. I don't know if I am or not, but it looks like Don Williams is live, and we're doing how can you base your modern life on a book written for a primitive culture? And we have had kind of an interesting conversation getting into this to begin with. So, Dr. Williams, we're going to turn the platform over to you. Uh, we're not even going to ask it how do we know the Bible is true or reliable. We've done that in the past. We'll come up to it again in the future, I'm sure. And we have another team member. Oh, there they are. Another team member coming in belatedly.
Hey, how's it going?
Our
I got
Colorado crew.
the
Uh,
crew.
Don Williams, how can you base your modern life, on a book written for a primitive generation?
Well, I think we have to start by understanding the question and why it is a question. And it's a big question for a lot of people because the world has changed in some pretty radical ways. Actually, the world hasn't changed. I mean, it's still rotating on its axis and taking 24 hours to do it. It's still moving around the sun and taking 365.25 days to do that every year. And the laws of physics we were talking about recently are still working. So the world hasn't changed, but we get the impression that it has. And where do we get that? We get it from the fact that uh, human culture has changed in some pretty radical ways that really do change our way of experiencing the world and change our default settings about how we relate to it. And so, given that some of these changes are as profound and radical as they actually are, the question really becomes pretty insistent as how can anything written before people were dealing with this stuff, you know, how can that be relevant? Even if it's true, how can it possibly be relevant to us and guide our lives today in this world that we're living in? So let's start by looking at some of the ways in which the world has changed. And it's easy not to understand how radical this is. Here's an overview. We're going to talk about modernity, the modern world, what it is, why it's different from everything that's gone before. We're going to talk about secularization, which is the process that has come from living in modernity to change the way people see the world. And then we'll look at things that don't change because the impression is created, and every one of us is affected by this. It's easy to get the impression that everything's different, but not everything is. And then finally, we'll be able to look then at how the Bible relates to those things that are permanent and don't really change, even if it seems like they do. So let's start with this whole idea of what it means to be in the modern world. The world has changed in some pretty radical ways. Um, in fact, the human the human experience of living in the world for the last 2-3 thousand years, all but about 150 years of it, were pretty much the same. In other words, people traveled by using the horse and buggy ever since they invented the chariot. They improved the buggy with springs and better cushioning and stuff, but it was essentially the same technology. And then all of a sudden, you got railroads and steamships and automobiles and airplanes, and that has all happened really in just a generation or two. My father could remember seeing his first automobile. My father could remember seeing his first airplane. He was born in 1915. The first automobile didn't make it to Noonan, Georgia until he was old enough to remember it being a new thing. Uh, he could remember seeing his first automobile and his first airplane, and he lived to see people walk on the moon. In other words, that one lifespan went from essentially the ancient world to the modern world. Just one lifespan. You got things are changing really, really, really slowly, and then boom, they take off in ways that's almost hard to even comprehend. Let's get our list back up and think about some of the ways in which that has happened. Um, Ways in which our lives are different from the lives of almost all of our ancestors. Some of us who are younger, even our parents, don't remember the world like it used to be. Think about sanitation. Okay, uh, sanitation is a huge issue because disease results if you don't do it, and we didn't figure out how to do it until starting with the Industrial Revolution in the middle of the 18th century, which is just yesterday on a historical scale. So you got bubonic plague. In 1349, bubonic plague broke out in Europe, and 1/3 of the entire population of Europe died in 1 year. And why? Because bubonic plague was transmitted by fleas. Okay, and it was the Middle Ages. Everybody had fleas. People had fleas then, just like dogs have them now. And people didn't understand that. But you know, your sanitation for most of human history was okay. You go to bed at night, and if you live in a town, you live in a 2-story house. The bottom story is your business, like your blacksmith shop or your bakery or your candle maker shop or your wheel maker shop or whatever. And then the family lives upstairs. Okay. During the night, sometimes your body wants to get rid of certain substances. So you don't have indoor plumbing, you don't have a bathroom, and it's the middle of the night, you don't want to go out to the outhouse. So you put this stuff in a chamber pot, right? And then what do? In the morning, you open the window and you fling it out into the street. This is human sanitation for almost all of human history. So you can imagine that there's rats all over the place, and the fleas jump from the rats who have the bubonic plague and bite the people, and that's how people get it. And it was a threat to human existence forever until suddenly people figured out, maybe if we could figure out ways to make water work for us and the whole idea of sanitation was just something that people didn't even comprehend for most of history. Nutrition. We get frustrated if we don't have enough variety in our diet, if we got to eat the same thing too many times in a row. Ancient people, and by ancient people, I mean everybody up until after the Industrial Revolution, and it only starts to change then. Their big issue was, are they going to get anything to put in their mouth that is reliable? And you get famines happening all the time. We get frustrated if prices go up a little too fast. Most of us basically keeping ourselves well fed is not an issue. As a result of health, I mean, up until practically the 19th century, they thought the way to cure diseases was to poke a hole in your veins and bleed you. Because you got to get the bad blood out. Nobody understood germs until modern medicine begins in about the 19th century, and gradually we figure out, there's more intelligent things we can do when people are sick or people are hurt. Anesthesia. up until practically the 20th century, anesthesia is a shot of whiskey and a bullet, because bullets are lead and lead is soft, and you can bite the bullet without breaking your teeth, because that's the only way you're going to get through having your legs sawed off while you're still awake, because you got shot with a mini ball in the Civil War.
Right.
You know, we don't comprehend the way the world has changed.
Sure.
We have houses that are bigger, more better insulated and heated and cooled. Air conditioning was not a thing until about 100 years ago. It wasn't a thing that people took for granted and that everybody had until, I mean, I can remember the first time I rode in an air-conditioned car in the summer. I thought that was just incredible. Transportation, like I said, my father could remember his first car and his first airplane and lived to watch men walk on the moon. That shows you how much it's changed and how quickly the change it just starts with the Industrial Revolution, harnessing of steam power, etc. But it starts building slowly, and then all of a sudden, in one lifetime, you go from a world that's basically the same world that human beings lived in for their entire existence to the modern world. In one lifetime. That's pretty crazy. And in communication, the telephone's only about 100 years old. It's less than that everybody had one. And now people can't even remember landlines. The fact that you had to actually be in your house to call somebody on the phone, or else they had these little booths with phones in them stuck up on the side of the road, or in the airport, and you had to go and put quarters in it to try to call somebody.
Yep.
And Superman could change in those booths too.
Yeah.
I mean, this has caused a total breakdown in the entire world of superheroes. That's why they have exploded the way they have, is because they've had to figure out new ways of being superheroes, because they don't have phone booths anymore. And
right.
So now, instead of just Superman and Batman, we've got the whole Marvel and DC universes.
Yes.
That's exploding, just like personal computers.
Oh my gosh.
I can remember in seminary typing term papers on a manual typewriter. And then, oh my goodness, word processing. Oh, then the next step was the IBM Selectrics.
Oh, yeah.
You could actually remember a couple of lines that you could go back and correct if you didn't type too far past catching your mistake. And now personal computers, and now you've got in your phone more computing power than was in the Apollo spacecraft that went to the moon. Computers used to take up an entire room. UNIVAC.
Big machines. Yeah.
They used to. It took an entire room for a computer to exist, and only governments and major corporations could afford to have them. Now, we've got computers in our washing machines and our refrigerators. Why, I don't know. But I mean, everything is connected, and you've got people whose world is in their screen, the little screen on their phone. I've seen kids in the cafeteria at my college sitting across the table from each other, texting each other on their phone instead of just looking up, making eye contact, and actually having a conversation.
Right.
So, information is available in ways that it never was before. You can Google anything now. And the result is, I've noticed kids no longer think they need to carry facts around in their heads. because they can always Google them if they want them.
Right.
And the problem with that is, of course, that when you're looking at the fact on your Google little screen, if you don't have an organized universe of facts and connections in your head, you have no context for understanding the fact
Right.
that you're looking at.
Right.
Mhm.
So, our way of connecting to the world is radically different. And that brings us to modernity. Let's back up.
I went too far this time.
Yeah. Uh,
Oops.
I
back
can't
up.
get to-
That's the other direction.
Reverse.
Here we go.
modernity you want?
Modernity. Here we go. So, yeah, before we move past it, let's think about the electric light. Okay. Thomas Edison, end of the 19th century, right? You get the electric light. People don't realize how much that has changed the world.
Mhm.
It hit home to me back in about 1970, the summer of about 71 or 2. I was in the Andes Mountains, and we were driving through the Andes Mountains on a bus in Ecuador, and we stopped in this little village for a pit stop. The pit stop was literal. It was a 2-hole bore.
Literal pit.
Little-
An outhouse.
Yeah.
And people had to take turns, and so there was a nice little wait. And I was lucky enough to get done early. So while I was waiting, I walked down the street in this little village just to look around, check things out. The only electric light in that village was the headlights of the bus. Everything else was candles or kerosene lamps, that kind of stuff, that kind of thing.
Mm.
So there's no electric light. There's no electric light between us and the horizon. We're 10,000 feet up in the Andes Mountains. There's not that much atmosphere above us. And there's no light pollution. There's a concept. If you haven't heard that phrase, it's very important. Light pollution means that we're generating so much electric light in the nighttime that it blots out half of the night sky.
Mhm.
Most of us have never seen the night sky the way our ancestors did.
Mhm.
Okay. David, Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. And we read that and we say, yeah, okay, fine. That, we can see what he's trying to say there. I walk around the corner out of sight of the bus, so there's no light pollution at all. I happened to look up and I thought I was going to die because the stars were these piercing points of light in a sky blacker than you can imagine, and they weren't just sitting there twinkling. They were like they were trying to bore holes through you. And that verse of from Revelation came into my mind about people wanting the rocks to fall on them to protect them from the glory of God. I was like, oh, that's what you were talking about. Now, isn't it interesting that the rise of atheism, which was practically non-existent for most of human history, there have always been skeptics and there have always been atheists, but they were like 1% of the population, practically non-existent. And it starts rising right when the electric light comes along. I don't think it's a coincidence, because what's happening is the heavens are still showing the glory of God, and the firmament is still showing. The heavens are still telling the glory of God. The firmament is still showing his handiwork, but most of it's blotted out.
Mm.
I have been about as far away from civilization as you can get east of the Mississippi River. camping out on top of Albert's Mountain on the Appalachian Trail. About as little light pollution as you can find in the eastern United States. But still, on the other side of the horizon was light flowing up into the sky from Greenville, South Carolina. And yeah, the stars were more impressive than what most of you see when you go outside, but still nothing like what I saw in Ecuador. So,
Well, and the other thing is you're right about the rise of the electric light and how it changes that made, but there's also the hubris of humans who look at all of the new technologies they're coming up with and going, we don't really need God. Look at all this great stuff that we made with our own hands.
well, yeah, and it's easier for them to think that because the messages that God programmed into the created world to remind us that he exists and how awesome and powerful he is are blunted. People aren't seeing them. I mean, you add to the fact that more people live in cities. Most of the history of the human race, a small percentage of the population were urban. Almost everybody lived in the country. Now it's completely reversed. And so you have people in urban neighborhoods. You have children in urban neighborhoods who think milk comes from cartons. They haven't made the connection between milk and cows. Okay, so natural revelation is still there, but most of us aren't being impacted by it because we have created a world that insulates us from it. Okay, and at a certain point, human pride has always existed, and so if you give us half a chance, we're going to think we don't need God, and we're going to think that our power to do all this stuff is sufficient. But it's not just that; it's that being driven by the fact that what was obvious to our ancestors is no longer obvious to us, simply because we've blinded ourselves to it. We've created an artificial environment that protects us from it. And there are a couple of aspects of that. One of them is that we're now surrounded by machines, okay? I don't grind coffee beans and boil them in a pot. You know, I stick a pod in a Curie. Everything is done by machines. I don't build a fire to cook my dinner. I stick it in a microwave oven. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I want to go back to doing these other things, although I think people should have that experience still in their life so that they understand, yeah, this is a connection to an older world. But the domination of machines and the pace of change are two things that have had a powerful effect on our thinking. The domination of machines. We're surrounded by machines, and machines are constantly changing because they're creations that we're constantly improving on. Okay, what would you rather drive? A 1970 Ford Fairmont or any car being produced today? You know, I mean, the 70s cars were the worst because we had just become conscious of gas fuel economy because the gas crisis had caused everybody to say, oh, we need to get, and it was a trade-off, you know, the more fuel economy, the less acceleration. Yeah. And my little escape could leave that 1970 Ford I had in the dust and still get twice the gas mileage it got.
Right.
You know, that we got GPS now. machines are getting better. What would you rather have? The computer you're watching this class on, or a TRS-80?
Hmm.
Okay. We have
The,
power.
the TRS-80 was a lot less irritating, I have to tell you.
Well, in some ways it was, and in some ways it was more if you wanted to get it to do something.
Right.
But so your computer that you're using today is probably more powerful than the one you were using 5, 10 years ago. The phone you've got in your pocket right now probably does a lot more stuff more efficiently than the one you had 5 or 10 years ago. My phone is better than the last phone I had, and I fully expect the next phone I buy, which I'm putting off as long as I can because I hate trying to learn a new one.
Mhm.
But if it's not better than the one I've got, why would I buy it?
Right.
Machines are constant. Everything always gets better. That's the environment we've created for ourselves to live in. And consequently, evolution makes sense to people
Right.
because they live in a world where things are constantly improving and developing. They don't live in a world that our ancestors lived in where things were basically the same as they had been for the last millennium. Okay? So, as implausible as the idea of everything coming from nothing and nothing being able to organize itself into DNA, and as implausible as those ideas are, they make sense to people today because they live in an artificial world created by human culture in which change for the better is the norm. It's the default setting. Things get better. So why shouldn't biological organisms get now?
Yeah. So
People who understand evolution realize that these people have a very naive concept of what they mean by the fittest, survival of the fittest. But it's what makes it make sense to people.
it sort of does, and in part it's because we're not. It's not being explained to them, because you look at the technological evolution, if you will, argues for an intelligent designer that's guiding that evolution, making the changes and tinkering with it.
But you're assuming that people are actually thinking about this stuff.
Well, I'm not assuming they're actually thinking about it. I'm assuming no one is teaching them how to think about it.
Right. Nobody's teaching them, and they're not thinking about it. What we're talking about is the unthinking default setting that you get just by living in the 21st century in a developed country.
Right.
And that's the default setting you're going to have, unless, as you point out, Don, unless somebody does something about it.
Right.
That's our job. That's why we're having this whole thing, to try to understand what's happening and see what we can do about it. Okay. Now, so you get the impression that not only is everything getting better, but the speed at which it's happening is something we've gotten used to, but which my father was still capable of being astonished by. So the impression is there that things are evolving, everything is changing, and consequently, old ideas are probably bad ideas. Okay, old computers are bad computers compared to new computers. So old ideas are probably bad ideas compared to new ideas. Again, if you actually stop and think about this, you realize that's dumb. Ideas have to be evaluated based on their success in describing reality, not based on when they showed up in history. But again, people don't think about it, and consequently, this is the kind of thing that happens in their heads. In fact, though, not everything has changed, and some things have not. Our experience of the way we experience the world has changed because now we have created this filter of technology between us and the world, which causes us to have these assumptions like new ideas are better than old ones. But they're only assumptions, and they're not very well grounded assumptions. But the world hasn't changed. People may now think that milk comes from cartons, but if there weren't farms with cows, those cartons would be empty. Or they'd have something else, probably something much nastier in them. The world hasn't changed. Our experience of the world has changed. And so what we should realize, because now we're trying to get people to start thinking about this instead of just letting it sway their minds sort of automatically, is you can't assume that because something is old, it's out of date.
Right.
Okay. If your car or your computer is old, it probably is out of date, but cows aren't out of date. Even though it's no longer obvious that we need them to get the milk, we still do. Okay. Yep. And if you don't realize that and they put you in charge of the economy, you're going to make a real mess of things. Well, one of the things that's changed is mainly the thing that's changed is technology, which means ways of doing stuff. Okay. So a week or two ago, we were talking about whether or not a sentence like murder is wrong could be objectively true. Okay. And we decided, yeah, we better hope it can. And in fact, yes, it is. It can be objectively true. And we saw that it was. It was objectively true 2,000 years ago. It was objectively true longer ago than that, where if I wanted to kill somebody, I could bash him in the head with a rock, or I could shoot him with an arrow, or stick him with a knife, or throw a spear at him. Okay. Now, if I want to kill somebody, I can still do those things, but I have other options. Now I can blow them away with a handgun. I can throw them out the window of a skyscraper. I can run over them with a car. I've got lots of more options how to do it. But is having more options change the meaning of the act?
Outcome is still the same.
No. The fact that I got lots more ways at my disposal how to do something doesn't change the meaning of the act. The fact that I can Google facts doesn't change the fact that I need to have some kind of framework for understanding those facts, or they don't mean anything. It doesn't change the fact that they're either true or false. And they're not really facts if they're false, and people present things as facts that aren't. None of that's changed. And so people get the impression that, well, objective truth is a passé idea, or this ancient book. I mean, good grief, what could Paul know? He didn't even have a cell phone. But technology doesn't really change the most basic fundamental things. Those things don't change. The fact that they got more ways of finding out information doesn't change the fact I still got to figure out, is it true or false, and what does it mean? The fact that I got more ways of killing my neighbor doesn't change the meaning of that act, that it's a wrong thing to do unless there's a special circumstance like self-defense.
Right. Now here just back up a second. Because, and I agree with you, obviously, I do agree with you on that, except that, and you have this in here, our experience of that act and the meaning of it to us because of our experience has changed in many cases. That's why you can, and we do see a different kind of meanness in culture where it somehow is worthy of having someone use their phone to video you beating up elderly people so you can post it on YouTube.
Well, yeah. Let me remind you of a distinction we made, was it last week, between the subjective meaning. The objective meaning hasn't changed. Murder is still murder, is still wrong. But because our experience has changed, the subjective meaning that people attach to it, it's not as easy for them to see the obviousness of the wrongness of some of these actions. You remind me of the guys back in, was it Desert Storm? It was one of those. It was the invasion of Iraq, and the guys who mistreated the prisoners and
Right.
put it on their cell phones and showed it. Like, what are you thinking?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we aren't thinking. Our ability to see the obvious has been undercut by the fact that the effect of these changes in the way we interact with the world, we haven't thought about them, and consequently they mislead us into thinking all kinds of insane things. When I say the meaning hasn't changed, I'm talking about the objective meaning that the act of murder has in itself, but people's subjective understanding of that certainly has changed.
Yeah.
And that's the essence of the problem. Okay, so if
isn't that also another sidetrack? Their objective understanding of it has changed. Is that also related to the loss of sort of the Judeo-Christian worldview, which viewed humans in a certain light, versus today where humans are just meaningless? It doesn't matter if I hurt someone or kill someone, as long as I'm happy.
Traditional values are under assault in every society.
Mm-hmm.
Now, our central concern, of course, is that the Judeo-Christian worldview, the biblical worldview, let's get more specific, the Christian worldview has receded in influence. It's like buckets in a well. As the influence of modernity and secularization goes up, then the influence of the Christian worldview goes down. And one of the desperate things we need to do, if we are not going to end up in a technological barbarism, is to restore people's confidence, people in general's confidence in traditional values, and specifically the confidence of believers in the gospel and the fact that ultimately those traditional values can only be maintained if, in fact, we see the God of the Bible as the foundation for them and for everything. Meaning is a personal thing. It has to come from a personal source. And God ultimately is that source. Well, how does this relate then to the Bible? The Bible and permanent things. Some things have changed and some things have not. And the things that have not changed turn out to be the things that are more foundational and basic. Okay? The world hasn't changed the way we experience it has, but the world is still the same. Morality hasn't changed. People's ideas about it have become more relativistic because of secularization, but murder is still wrong. And people's relativism can be refuted. Unfortunately, you get in a lot of trouble if you perform the refutation. If you tell me that traditional morality is passé, all I got to do is knock you in the head and take your wallet, and you will suddenly have an enlightening experience about how the fact. But you won't say, "Well, this was just inconvenient." No, it's wrong, and you know it's wrong.
Yeah.
And
Scream and holler.
I have just in this thought experiment, and I'm going to leave it as a thought experiment. Fortunately, I can't steal your wallet online over the computer. Well, I could, but not with what we're doing in this program, and not unless you give me information that you should not give me. The point is, I will. If I did this, I would have forced you out of your nice little cocoon of theory into contact with reality. And in reality, as opposed to theory, stealing is wrong and assault is wrong. It's not just inconvenient, it's not just painful and something we don't like. It's actually wrong. And everybody knows this. They just don't want to admit it. But if you force them to, they will. So, ancient books come from a time, they actually become not less important, but more important. I'm going to talk about ancient books in general and then move to the Bible specifically. Living in an age of modernity and secularization makes ancient books more important, not less important. Why? Because they come from a time when people were more in touch with those aspects of reality than we are. For example, Homer's Iliad can tell you more about the nature of human conflict and war and what human pride does to make war unavoidable than practically any book that's ever been written. Homer, it's about like 700-800 BC, about the Trojan War. And I have taught the Iliad in lit class, and I found it very interesting when I have older students who are military people who've been in the army, been in the military, in conflict, like in Desert Storm or some of these things. And they come back to school on the GI Bill now, and they read that, and they have a completely different reaction to it than their contemporaries, or than they're not contemporaries.
Than the younger students.
Yeah. They have it's like, oh my goodness, this guy gets it. This is the way it is. When C.S. Lewis was first deployed in World War I, and for the first time in the trenches, he went over the top and he heard a bullet whizzing past his head. His first thought was, this is war. This is what Homer described.
Real.
Now, the technology was spears instead of guns, but the human factor has stayed the same for over 2 millennia. And because you're not getting it fed to you in a way that you're used to everything, and so you don't have to stop and think about it, the impact is there. The Odyssey, Homer's other great epic, can tell you an awful lot about love and faithfulness and home and why these things matter. If you want to understand the role of personal sacrifice for a cause, and how that ennobles a human being. And if you want to understand the tragedy of giving that loyalty to a cause that's not really worth it, Virgil's Aeneid. Virgil didn't intend to teach that second lesson. He was giving you Aeneas, who was making great sacrifices for the sake of the founding of Rome, which was going to, by prophecy, come from his descendants. And Virgil lived about 40 BC, and by about that long AD, you have the corruption of Nero, the idealism of Rome bringing the Pax Romana and law and civilization to the world had turned into Nero and corruption, and the tragedy of all those sacrifices for this, which Virgil doesn't know, but with hindsight, you add your knowledge of history to the reading of that text. These books, because they're ancient books, can speak to us powerfully, and they can get us back in touch with aspects of reality that the modern world makes it hard for us to see. They're therefore more important, not less important. It's precisely because they come from a pre-technological era that that the message can come through uncluttered and consequently more powerfully. Not quite ready for this slide yet.
Okay.
One. So back up just one.
Oh, back up just one. Sure, you want everything, don't you?
Yeah.
Beep, beep, beep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go. The subtitle here, meaning with authority. Okay. Ancient books are meaningful in ways that we need, and they can get us back in touch with not just subjective, but really objective truths about human nature and the meaning of life and the meaning of the world and our values. And the Bible is one of them, but it has one big advantage that the other ones don't, and that is now you have meaning that comes with authority. Okay, if you read Virgil, if you read Homer, Sophocles, Plato, Aristotle, there's a lot of wisdom there. There's a lot of truth there, but there are also things that you wouldn't want to swallow just because these guys said it. But when the Creator, who gave the world its form, gave it its meaning, and has worked in it for our salvation, when He's giving you the message, because of the way the Bible is inspired through the prophets and the apostles, as we talked about in our very first episode, that's the best that there is. I mean, that is has all the advantages of other ancient literature, with the addition of coming from the one who really knows us better than we know ourselves, knows what real truth and meaning and beauty are, because He put them into the world, and that's why they're there. Knows what the meaning of life is, because He's the Creator and the designer and the Redeemer and the Savior. And so when you understand how modernity and secularization have impacted us, instead of making us think, oh, well, we don't need the Bible because that's a different world. Well, actually, that's one of the reasons why we do need it. Because it gets us back in touch with the most basic truths, and ones that the modern world is liable to blind us to, especially if we do what almost everybody does, and that is simply absorb the default settings that living with machines gives you. And I'm not wanting to give any of my machines up. I'm glad I've got them. They're wonderful tools. I don't want them to control my mind
Right.
simply by existing and by being my environment. And staying in touch with ancient literature, and especially the Bible, uh, is what gives me a chance to actually see things as they are and not simply as the illusions that are created by this artificial world we find ourselves living in now.
Mhm. Amen to that.
That kind of raises another question, artificial world. How is AI going to add to the problem?
Mm.
Because I don't see it solving the problem. I think it's going to add to the problem.
I agree. That's the next step.
The
The
next
step
process.
that's happening right now, which nobody actually knows what it's going to
Rise of the
be.
machines.
Uh, it means the guys who are still teaching and haven't retired yet are going to have one more type of plagiarism
Yeah.
to try to find, and it may be harder to find. Although there's going to be ways to deal with it. You know, when a student who couldn't write a complete sentence all semester suddenly gives me a grammatically perfect term paper, I'm like,
It's a miracle.
all I got to do is type a sentence from this paper into my computer, and it'll tell me the online source you stole it from. You know, and your sorry carcass is nailed, and people will figure out ways of
Sure.
spotting ChatGPT.
That's true for spotting it, but I'm thinking in a different way and we've talked about this before,
Mhm.
most everyone gets their information by osmosis. It just filters into their brain
Mhm.
from whatever sources they're in contact with. And
Mhm.
so now you're going to be having your worldview shaped, thinking that it's coming from a reliable source, stuff found on the computer,
Mhm.
but it may not be at all reliable because that is just a compilation of all the available data. It's not
Right.
thinking through what the ramifications are.
Well, yeah, and in a way that adds a new wrinkle. In another way, it doesn't change anything because if you think your computer's a reliable source, you've already made that mistake
Yeah,
before
exactly. Yeah.
before artificial intelligence got involved because somebody's got to program it. Somebody had to feed that information into Wikipedia or into Google. That was a human being who might have had an agenda. I mean, if you don't have a filter other than Google
Right.
or Wikipedia uh, by which you are evaluating information that comes to you, uh, and it can't just be does it reinforce my preconceived notions either, which is what the filter that most people use.
Right.
It's called
Yeah.
confirmation bias.
Yeah.
We already need to be thinking that way, and this means we'll have to be even more vigilant about it because, if you're not careful, it'll look like something that it's not.
Which brings back to something you already said. That raises again the importance of older literature. So you can actually read what C.S. Lewis wrote, what Homer wrote, what each of these sources of information,
Hmm.
what they
Yeah,
actually wrote and thought.
I think we're
Mhm.
actually ready for that summary now.
Okay, and we can do that fast.
Ooh.
The word primitive doesn't just mean undeveloped; it can also mean original and unspoiled. In that sense, we need the Bible as the guide to our modern life precisely because it's primitive. It can root you in reality as no other book, ancient or modern, can. The reality that does not change. And so, yeah,
Here, here.
there's the whole point in a nutshell. Uh, there are a couple of more slides actually we can look at just for a second before we run out of time. Uh,
What is the reality?
This perfectly good apologetics class have been taken over by crass commercialism. I don't understand it. Resources. The Young Christian Survival Guide is the text we're following week after week. So if you find any of these lectures interesting and want more from where it came from, or want to see it in written form, that's where you need to go. And then, literally hot off the press, because I just got mine this weekend, Answers from Aslan, The Enduring Apologetics of C.S. Lewis. The word enduring is the key word for tonight's discussion. Lewis is 80 years ago.
Wow.
He was writing during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And the world has changed in that period of time. So I'm dealing there with how Lewis, Lewis, for a lot of people today, will count as an ancient writer. I'm getting pretty ancient myself, and I'm still here. So Lewis is definitely ancient. How can his arguments best be presented to today's audience so it can see their true force and power is the topic of that book.
Mm-hmm.
So,
it's interesting you raise that up, because as you know, one of my mentors was the late Dr. Norman Geisler, and I loved the way he thought, and I wished he could just pour it in my brain. And then I did this weird thing. I started reading the Ante-Nicene Fathers, and I went, that's where he got a lot of his stuff from. Thomas Aquinas. I went, it's not original.
Wait a minute.
Yeah. So that's what's happening when you read C.S. Lewis. It's the same kind of a thing.
Yeah. And when you read Homer and Virgil and those guys, then you say, oh, this is where C.S. Lewis stole that.
Yeah.
They say if you steal from one person, it's plagiarism. If you steal from many people, it's scholarship. If you steal from everybody, it's genius.
There you go. Words to live by.
So I've got a question for you, Don. What in your conclusion, the last words say the reality that does not change.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say to sum that up? What is the reality that does not change?
God.
The ultimate reality that doesn't change is God himself. And the world that God made is miraculously stable. I mean, it's, they say object permanence, you're supposed to learn that when you're about what, 2 or 3?
Mm-hmm.
You cover something up for a baby, the baby doesn't realize it's still there.
Right.
But, when I was in high school, for goodness sakes, we would go camping. We'd take these camping trips from Georgia out to California and back, going through the Rockies and camping out in the summer. We'd be gone for 3-4 weeks, and we'd get back home and our house was still right where we left it. I was like, this is incredible. I mean, this is so cool that God made the world that way. Object permanence is still astonishing me as an old guy. I've never actually gotten over it, that God made a world that really is stable, and the same laws, the object that was in motion, that tended to stay in motion during the scientific revolution in the 1700s, is still doing it, and it's amazing. So the basic laws of physics are stable, reliable, and the basic laws of morality and the basic truths about goodness and beauty and about the meaning of life, they don't change. What changes is methods.
Right.
We get more options of ways to do things, but it's the same things we're trying to do. Okay.
Right.
Our ancestors wanted to learn information, and they had to go through it in a more laborious way, and they didn't have as many options. But curiosity, the curiosity of the human mind, the hunger of the human mind for truth, even
Always
when
there.
it denies that it has it, is still there. The basic ground root things don't change, and the Bible gives you the clearest vision of them that you're going to get.
Yep.
That helpful?
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, that is important. And in your discussion, like your discussion with your son, I realize it's frustrating, but he has, and we've talked about this before, an investment in not believing.
Yeah, that's what it seems like.
And that's a difficult thing to overcome because you could show him all the evidence in the world. And it's like, and I've told this story before. I was in construction, as you know, for 40 years. And the story that just reminds me so clearly about that kind of a situation was when we built some offices in Chicago. And one set of offices was a woman in each one. And everything had been field tested. The airflow in each office, the thermostats, everything was tested and verified, and we had the charts and all that. And then I started getting phone calls from one office, I'm too hot, another office, I'm too cold. And I could go down there and I could show them everything is set, it's working perfectly, it's calling for 72 degrees, that's what you're getting. And I would give them all the evidence, and then they would look at me and they go, okay, but I'm hot.
It's an internal problem.
Yeah. So what I did was a weird thing. After a couple of weeks of that, I went and bought 10 thermostats. And I went down there on a Saturday and I went in and I put a thermostat in each office. Wasn't connected to anything.
Pseudo.
All of the calls.
Yeah.
That was smart. Yeah.
They did that in our offices at school. You're that guy. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm that guy. It didn't change anything except they felt like they had control, and so now it was okay.
So now they could fidget with it and like, oh, I feel better now.
Whatever. Yeah. So that's what we sometimes run into, and I think you're running into something like that.
Yes.
He has a vested interest,
Yeah.
some belief that's saying, I can't accept this because of, which is unrelated to the evidence that's available.
Right.
Well, I had an experience in Peru, just like Don had. Kind of, I looked up in the sky. I was out near the river, way out in the Amazon, and I saw the Milky Way.
Mm-hmm.
And right there, it inspired in me awe. There's got to be a designer, but we have to understand somebody else could be standing there and say, wow, science is cool. Look what it did. So, it doesn't work for everybody the same way, thank God. And we know why biblically. So we got that to deal with, I think, is a big thing too.
Yeah. People have all kinds of reasons for what they believe. And often the ones they tell you aren't the ones that are actually driving it.
Exactly.
Correct.
That's the point.
Right. Yep.
That's important to understand for sure.
Yeah.
All right. Well, for anyone who's tuned in and watching, we're glad you joined us. We will be back next week. Have a great Thanksgiving this week, and we will talk to you all later. Bye.
Adios.